So currently, he's a visiting scholar at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of Oxford University. His research interests are in theology and mission history, church and society, and religion, culture, and public life. And I'm sure that Bishop, you have published many articles and chapters and books, but if I can highlight only two important books, the first one is The Church, God's Pilgrim People, and the second one is The Church in the World, a historical-ecclesiological study of the Church of Uganda with particular reference to Post-Independence Uganda from 1962 to 1992. So today's lecture title is The Modern Christianity as a Narrative of the Deception of Empire, whether the promise of love, justice, and peace in the gospel. So with this one, we hand it over to Bishop.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible enough. Let me just outline what I'm going to do. I will make a brief introduction. And then after that, I will outline what I see and the logic of what I present to you today. And then I'll get into the material. Let me just acknowledge that this paper was first presented at a conference, a forum, hosted by the International Fellowship of Missioners Transformation under the Stot Bediaco Forum in Aradrom, Romania, in October 2022. Since then, it's developed, it has some life, and I'm hoping that after this conversation, there may be one or two things that can be added or subtracted. What I really seek to do is to invite us to look in the rear mirror, hindsight, look together and make sense of where we have come from in order to gain better perspective where we are going. As we look back, or at least as I do, I recognize that there are certain things that we've taken for granted as good. One of those is Christianity, as we know it. And so we think of ourselves as ambassadors of Christianity. And we take for granted that Christianity is a good thing. And that the exception simply proves that Christianity is still a good thing. The second thing that we've taken for granted is that mission is a good thing. Christian mission is a good thing. I'd like to suggest that we look at these a little bit more. What I do is look back, hindsight, and hindsight is such an important thing. We often forget that the Gospels were written in hindsight, possibly 30, 40, 50 years after Jesus had ascended, after the Holy Spirit had been given. So let's try and attempt hindsight our own story. It is important to acknowledge that I do this from my social location. In other words, my history matters. And so I will be able to outline why this has mattered to me over the last, at the very least, 4 decades of active living in the name of Christ. What I see is what I present. That as I look in the rear mirror, what I see is modern Christianity as a narrative of the deception of empire. And it causes me to ponder and ask, which is the invitation to us, where then is the promise of love, shalom, and justice that is clear in the story of Jesus of Nazareth, the story, the gospel of the kingdom of God? Hence my title, Modern Christianity as a Narrative of the Deception of Empire, with the promise of love, peace, and justice in the gospel. I've already indicated that my reflections are informed by my social location. I hope we'll acknowledge, which especially those of us who are privileged don't often do, and especially those of us who've lived and breathed the air of empire and the waters of empire. Let's restate that what anyone claims to know, what meaning we or they attach to what they see, hear, feel, or taste, and touch is filtered through their experience. Theologians, especially us, and any who have a claim to ideas that shape life, reality, and the world, we have to contend with the reality that theology is by nature biographical. In fact, our biographies are the stuff that constitute our theologies. The other way to put it is that theologies are sociologies, and our sociologies shape our theologies. So I hope that as we engage intently and humbly with each other and each other's sociologies, our eyes will be opened to our blind spots. Let me therefore outline what it is that is critical to get a sense of where I am coming from, my social location. I was born and bred in rural Uganda. I am a rural boy, proudly rural boy. My parents were devoted to the gospel and to the church. That's important. There is a long story. I don't have time for it. I was socialized, or the word used is discipled. I was socialized through Western, particularly Euro-American educational processes and institutions in Uganda, in the United States, and in Scotland. That too is critical to understand where I'm coming from. My formation as a young adult follower of Jesus was through evangelical student movements, as well, which were birthed in the West, specifically the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students and its local manifestation, the Fellowship of Christian Unions. I spent some years at the British-based Church Mission Society, and I have served for many years as a bishop in the Church of Uganda, which, you might be surprised, proudly associates as part of the Anglican tradition. That too originating from the West. However, I must confess that these experiences broadened and opened my faith and experience of modern Christianity, churches. And as you have heard, I have done research in Uganda, but I have had the privileged opportunity of encountering this reality, this religion of Christianity across Africa and the West. Not enough. That is why this is an invitation to a conversation. I have been provoked to deep questioning, unlearning, certainly deconstructing much of what I appreciated as the gospel in my youth, as I have struggled over the years to make sense why it is that over its long history, Christianity has cohabited with conquest, injustice, oppression, repression, and exploitation. What's more troubling for me is the fact that we have continually, as already indicated, it's commonplace, we have said it as insiders, but also outsiders. They provoke us to suggest that Christianity and institutions hold the beacon of light and hope for the world. One of the things that will be important for me to clarify is that we must make a distinction between the religion of Christianity and the gospel. Because Christianity is not the good news of God, it's not the gospel, nor is the gospel Christianity. In this short essay, I submit that the dominant forms of Christianity, the religion of Christianity, which are today heralded as evidence of the progress of the gospel, are in fact a performance of the narrative of the deception of empire. I argue that to posit and hope that Christianity as is, as we know it, as we've experienced it, particularly in its modern forms, will trump empire. I argue that to propose and to hope for that is to walk the journey of despair akin to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, provided for us in that pericope in Luke chapter 24. Because I argue that both empire and hegemonic Christianity are a performance of the same logic of power. That the patterns of power, the power relations embedded in empire are the same logic, similar patterns as evident in modern Christianity. The essay will at the end call for deep soul searching over this, the collusion that I propose between Christianity and empire, the symbiotic relationship of these two. And I'm suggesting that this requires that first and foremost, we recognize and name it. Secondly, that we lament. And lament is not an event that's done, finished. It's actually lamenting itself as a way of living out the gospel. And then thirdly, one of the disciplines of lament is renouncing. Renouncing. And then lastly, relocation. So to recognize and name it, to lament, to renounce, and to relocate. Those as disciplines that I propose as the way looking forward. Let me try and clarify what I mean by empire in this essay, in this paper. We know that empire historically is a reference to political entities, long history. We know them, we've studied them, we've lived them. Empires as territorial expressions of power in which there is subjugation, occupation, exploitation of people's lands and resources, including conquest. But I'm suggesting that the word empire should be used to include not simply empires as we know them, that's a reality, but other hegemonic and subjugating forms of sociality, ways in which power is exercised, political, economic, or cultural patterns of power. Here, empire is the exercise of coercive, regulatory, and distributive power by which the one, either an individual or a community or a group, an individual or group, dominate and disregard the dignity of the other. So there is the one and the other. A way in which power is exercised that is characterized by egocentrism, hegemony, subjugation, and violence. At the core of empire is a way of perceiving, naming, and acting that is blind to the humanity of the other, and subsequently to the dignity and integrity of all creation. It is what our Latin American friends, theologians, particularly Nelson Maldonado Torres, has termed coloniality of being and of power, which really by that, it's simply a way of expressing the relationship of the one and the other. It is a way in which otherness is treated as less than. And he uses words of invisibility and dehumanization of the other as primary expressions of the coloniality of being. In regular speech, I think we would simply speak about coloniality as the process of othering the different one, other than you, other than me, other than us. You, your clan, your culture, your religion, your gender, your socio-economic status, or nation or state. Coloniality of being is that sense of the self as the center that relegates the other to the periphery, arrogating to the self a way of being and the other as non-being. We must not confuse coloniality for colonialism. Coloniality here clearly is a priori to colonialism because uncoloniality supersedes, is practiced post-colonialism because it's about patterns of power. As I have already indicated, the self could be an individual, a kinship, a social group. It could also apply to institutions and polities. You see, it is what happens in visibility, dehumanization, when the self arrogates to its being superiority, therefore subordinating, objectifying, and commodifying the other. It's what creates categories and labels such as believer, non-believer, religious, non-religious, Christian, non-Christian, white, non-white, the nonning of the other. It engenders isms, classism, racism, nationalism, sexism, producing stereotypes, labels, epithets, curses, categories, hierarchies, inner and outer rings of being human. It leads certainly to misnaming the other. So the other is named as enemy or pagan or unbeliever or Gentile, uncivilized, uneducated, and thereby justifying hegemony, subjugation, and violence. It is the instrumentalization of difference for instilling, entrenching, and normalizing guilt, fear, and shame. The DNA of coloniality, the DNA of empire is guilt, fear, and shame. Domination, exploitation, and violence are the logic of the coloniality of power and of invisibility. These are the logics of empire. They are also the logic of dominant Christianity, traceable certainly in the second half of the 3rd century through to the 4th, as Christianity refigured its place in the then Roman Empire. But certainly, and much more related to the work and the reading, the research I have done, beginning with the 15th century, when the interdependence between colonialism and Christian expansion was established. It is that pioneer, thinker, and student of mission history who helped us understand that colonialism was certainly part of mission, and mission was part of colonial conquest. And I quote, "The right to have colonies carried with it the duty to Christianize the colonized." Historian, African historian, Nigerian Obukalu observed that christened as the quest, that is mission, for gold, glory, and God, the admixture of commerce, politics, and religion are clearly the root of the enterprise, which provided an indelible coloring and left a big question as to which was actually dominant. My argument is that Christianity's posture as the agency of good news provided cover for dominance, exploitation, and violence of imperialism. The examples abound. I'll just highlight a few. We need not rehash and rehearse in detail the story of the transatlantic slave trade, which occurred between the 16th and 19th centuries, when an estimated, these numbers are estimates. And so when we say, and as historians speak about 10 to 15 million able-bodied Africans were transported to Americas, and an estimated 10 to 40% perishing in transit in different times and period. What is often not acknowledged is that slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, was anchored by a series of papal bulls. These are the official decrees by the popes particularly towards the end of the 15th century. I quote from one such of June 18, 1492, a bull sent to King Alfonso IV of Portugal. It's worth quoting. It authorized the King of Portugal, I quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, in bracket Muslims, and pagans, whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, that's the king, the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Much more could be said, and scholars have outlined this part of the story, but it will not be complete without quoting a papal bull, recognizing, acknowledging a papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI on May the 4th, 1493, which supported Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive rights to the lands discovered by Columbus the previous year. The bull stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered and exploited by Christian rulers, and it declared the Catholic faith and the Christian religion should be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, and the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. According to this narrative, what benefited the empires of Spain and Portugal, and later European colonial powers, would therefore benefit the church. We could go on to tell the story of the post-Reformation, quote-unquote, Christian wars between Catholics and Protestants in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, in which they killed each other by the hundreds. The long history of anti-Semitism, this is relevant among Christians in Europe, dating back to the Roman era, that inspired repeated massacres and expulsions from various countries, was certainly a performance of the same sensibility to domination and subordination. Fast forward today, the same logic seems to hold. Though Nazi leaders were often hostile to German churches, Christianity nevertheless provided the ideological support that made Holocaust possible. The United States of America, though primed as a country founded on Christian values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, bolstered the myth of the Pilgrim and Founding Fathers, but it's now a public secret that it was founded on destruction and wanton plunder of the indigenous nations of Americas. We now know that the Canadian myth of peaceful colonization has been cracked, and the evidence of systematic genocide of the native populations abounds. Today, I tell the story of the pain of Africa. The story of South Africa is well known. A systematic system of racial segregation, apartheid. and white minority rule, which too was built and justified and sustained by a Christian ideology for decades. Countless more tragic stories could be told. And I suggest that we dig deep into our history. Stories of inequality, discrimination, exploitation, domination, and not just that, but it's that Christianity was either silent or invoked as the moral for this performance of power, for this othering. Next door to me, I could tell stories of Uganda, where I have grown over the last many years, 7 decades now, counting. But let's talk about Rwanda, a very highly spoken about story, a country that was reputed to be Christian, with over 85% of the population at the time of the 1990s genocides. It was held as a model of Catholic evangelization in Africa. It is not just the magnitude of that genocide that is deeply distressing, but the culpability of the churches as institutions of Christianity. Is a book that has chronicled this, Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010 by Timothy Longman, which is a good reference. And Emmanuel Katongole too speaks in his various writings. And he questioned, how then did the fact that the majority of Rwandans were Christians, how then is it that it did not make any significant difference when it came to the events of 1994? Where was the church? Did God just turn his back on Rwanda? I suggest it's not the absence of the church that is in question. It is how dehumanization and violence defined the patterns of power that the church is justified and therefore embedded in that form of Christianity and institutions in Rwanda. Five centuries on, therefore, what do we see? That what the popes, the papal bulls of the late 15th century, Popes Nicholas V and Alexander VI in the 15th century, 5 centuries later, it was the case that churches in Rwanda were performing the same. I am arguing that in hindsight, this is how modern Christianity works. A narrative that enables and justifies the hegemony and violence of empire, while purporting to be the agency of humanity's circle. We have a letter from our friends, theologians and Christian leaders from Palestine who speak to this matter today. What is often not appreciated is that empires actually thrive through deception. And sadly, that deception continues. My argument here is that Christianity, therefore, is agency of that deception. Let me show, not only then, but even now, by bringing an example from our very own. In March 2000, colleagues from this very center were initiators, were the brains behind a conference between senior church leaders from 19 denominations from 21 African countries who met with officials of the World Bank, a conference ostensibly for alleviating poverty in Africa. Present were representatives of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the President of the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace in the Vatican, and invitees by the World Bank included representatives of development assistance programs, Australia, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, United Kingdom, and the United States. In a sense, capitalist empire was present, and Christianity in Africa was well represented, fully. Going by the breadth and depth of participation, The meeting of these church leaders and World Bank officials was certainly a meeting of two power centers shaping Africa's public square: Christianity and Western capitalism. On face value, going by the official report, and the book is here, I think in multiple copies, Faith in Development, Partnership between the World Bank and the churches in Africa. One could be tempted to believe that the conference was truly a collaboration between churches in Africa and the World Bank, premised on the assumption, and I quote, that if we together organize ourselves properly, in other words, Christianity and the World Bank, if we treat people as subjects, not as objects of development, if we consider not just the economic and social aspects, but also the cultural, and yes, even the spiritual aspects of human aspiration, then we will be a valuable instrument in building a new future for Africa. What we actually now know is that this was not a collaboration. The African leaders were invited to a table that they had minimal role in preparing. It was a case of the World Bank capitalizing on its financial power to exploit the perceived social capital of the churches. The report stated, the church brings its ability to influence constructively based on its numbers, its position as moral conscience of the nations, its closeness to the poor, and its own accountability to God. The churches in Africa have been shaped by the biblical story and hold it up as the source of liberation, transformation for abundant life, human dignity of all the people. Therefore, the church seeks to hold forth humane and spiritual values to underpin social, political, and economic development. The church represents the poor and the marginalized and can speak for them truthfully and forcefully. This sounds wonderful. Sounds true. Maybe the World Bank officials believed these assumptions. Going by the papers presented by some of the church leaders in the report, it is evident that the church leaders hoped that the World Bank would deliver on its commitments. However, it was a case of mutual deception. It's now over 2 decades later. Neither the churches nor the World Bank have much to show for their pronouncements and commitments made at the conference. Successive human development indices reports by the United Nations Development Programme are very clear that a long and healthy life, access to education, a decent standard of living continue to evade the majority on the continent of Africa. But we must really ask, did the World Bank really care about the poor and the marginalized of Africa? The detrimental impact of the Bretton Woods institutions, their structural development adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, the jury is out. They have been documented. Let's also ask, are the churches in Africa truly shaped by the biblical story? Are they truly accountable to God? I submit, the problem was not in their failure to organize ourselves properly, I quote, but rather in the intrinsic character of the patterns of power that undergird both Christianity and the Bretton Woods institutions. I submit, therefore, that to posit and hope that Christianity will trump empire is to walk the journey of despair akin to the two on the road to Emmaus. Let's take some time to talk about that story. It is powerful. You've read it. It's the two on the way to Emmaus, despondent, in despair because of the events of that weekend. The one they had hoped would be the Messiah, was the Messiah of Israel and indeed the world, had been killed by the very empire they had hoped he would conquer and vanquish. We therefore can understand their despair and despondence, the end of their hopes. That line, we had hoped. We had hoped. that he was the one going to redeem Israel. We don't have time to really dig into this story, plow it. It's powerful. I want to suggest that this encounter between Cleopas and his traveling companion, their encounter with Jesus, brings to the fore two narratives of power, patterns of power, a performance of power, embodied in the figure of the Messiah. I am suggesting that Cleopas and his friend, and indeed the entire Jewish establishment, had a particular narrative of messianic rule, the Messiah that would come, that clearly was crushed by the cross. But we see Jesus with a different narrative. Let's explore this a little bit. The narrative of Cleopas and his friend and the disciples gathered later in Jerusalem, which is the narrative they told their friend who joined them, this stranger of the events of the previous 3 days in Jerusalem that had caused deep distress, was a narrative based on a controlling story, a controlling narrative that was built on historical precedents and prophetic promises, and of course, even enshrined in the songs of the psalm. For you see, the anointed one of Israel was a king chosen by God to rule as God would, bringing God's salvation for the people and the sovereignty of Israel. The promised Messiah was expected to redeem Israel from a long history of shame, subjugation by foreign empires, and institute God's rule, in a sense, God's empire. And Israel was the center of that empire. So they located Jesus in this narrative. And so Jesus, for him to be this figure, this Messiah, he was supposed to possess superior coercive power and root out the current impositor, the Roman Empire, and reestablish Israel to its former glory. An imagination shaped by the warrior, triumphant King David, a vision undergirded by an imagination of God being invested in coercive power, a way in which God's action in history is coercing those that are now enemies of Israel, which envisioned a world in which Israel was the dominant power. It envisioned a Messiah that would possess superior power, vanquish and subdue Israel's enemies, establish her dominance over all the nations, an exercise in patterns of power that are characteristic of empire. Accordingly, this Messiah, such a Messiah, could not possibly suffer and die at the hands of the very empire he was supposed to vanquish. That's the story that Cleopas and his friend, as well as the Jews, lived and, to a large extent, continue to live. It's the narrative that informed the experience of Jesus for those 3 years. Alas, it had been crushed by the very empire he was expected to conquer. I use narrative as a method, not just as a genre, because narrative have so much power over us. I am arguing that because the disciples, Cleopas and his friends, lived, this is the story they told themselves. It's the story they had been told. It's the story they lived. It's the story they inherited. It's the story they believed would entrust to them a future. Narratives create imaginations. They are the lens through which we construct and construe the past and imagine the future, by which we even make the sense of the present, this moment, this place. They are the grid through which we make meaning of the world and its location. Narratives constitute the substructure of our imagination and the sense of who we are. Narratives embody patterns of power, power relations that give us a sense in which we imagine who God is and how God performs, expresses his power, and how we who name our life in the world by that name ought therefore to exercise that power. The narrative of the conquest Messiah, I'm arguing, is that narrative of conquest, of domination, subjugation, violence on behalf of one against the other. That's the narrative that Cleopas and his friends, and indeed the entire Jewish establishment, lived. But just as narratives symbolize hope, they also form the basis of our very fears and traumas. I submit that the story of the religion of Christianity today, modern Christianity, is like the story of the religion of the Jews, bondage to the imperial messianic narrative. It explains to a large part why the religion of Christianity seems not only incapable of disrupting political narratives of domination, conquest, injustice, and exclusion, but legitimizes them. One rightly wonders whether the religion of Christianity is not just redeemable, whether it's worth redeeming. Is it possible to turn the Titanic of the coloniality of being performed in Christianity over a long history that is justified by readings of the scriptures like Cleopas and his friend? Is it possible to reimagine a different way of spreading the influence of Christ in the world other than by conquest, other than by imposition and domination? Is it possible to imagine a different way of extending the mission of the influence of Christ without mission? The answer is in the story of how Jesus tells the story of the Messiah, of what happens. Jesus begins by rebuking and saying, "How foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and enter his glory?" Maybe we need to take a moment and hear that rebuke. How foolish you are. How foolish we evangelicals are. How foolish we Christians are. Slow to believe, slow to understand that God's way was never by conquest, domination, subjugation, dehumanization. How foolish we are to assign to God the concept of mission. That God is a missionary God. Missio Dei. Jesus said, "It is the Christ who suffered." And it's not any kind of suffering. It was suffering the violence of empire and its allies. It was death on the Roman cross. You see, the cross was an instrument of empire and its totalitarianism. It was a statement to any who was adjudged to be defiant to empire, a warning to all. It was a symbol of Roman imperial power, coercive, repressive, exploitive, dehumanizing, violent, with all claims of absoluteness. Much study has been done about this. And to ensure the full effect of its power to inflict suffering, shame, and humiliation of its victims, crucifixions were done in public display, besides busy roads or by the entrance of the city. Thurman has observed that when, I quote, "the power and tools of violence are on one side, the fact that there is no available or recognizable protection from violence makes the resulting fear deeply terrifying." The Roman cross was the epitome of the most extreme exertion of violence and invisibility of the other. Jesus' crucifixion embodied all the elements of coercive power of empire. injustice and dehumanization, horror and humiliation, and a mechanism for creating and entrenching a culture of guilt, fear, and shame. What is even surprising is the collusion between the Roman Empire and the Jewish religious establishment. However, I argue it actually makes sense. It should not surprise us because both shared the same perspective of performance of power, patterns of power. They both were invested in coloniality of power. Just like the collusion of modern empire and Christianity, both narratives of Rome's hegemony and of Israel's hope of the Messiah were grounded in coloniality of being. They both imagined a world in which they, Rome, Israel, were the center. A world in which they dominate. A world that revolves around them. A world in which the other, the rest. Does that remind us of the West and the rest? It sounds contradictory that an empire that declared its emperor as God would collude with a nation that claims allegiance to the creator as their God. However, what united both is the concept of transcendence, whereby transcendence is co-opted and invoked as the justification for subjugation, exploitation, dehumanization of the other, the coloniality of power. Both the Roman Empire and Israel shared an imagination of transcendence whose essential character was coloniality of being, one who exercises coercion in order to engender loyalty of the other. The violence where there is rebellion. From this perspective, transcendence is co-opted in the invisibility of the other. The invisibility of the other is justified by invoking transcendence. It is not surprising that both the Roman Empire and Israel claimed and justified their superiority by invoking a unique status with their gods. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is that we not only interrogate Christianity and its performance of power, it should cause us to ask questions about the God imagined by these forms of Christianity. Thus, in a rather devious way, the cross was the logical consequence of defying Jewish and Roman hegemonies. But as Jesus asserted, it was the Roman cross and his submission to its cruelty and shame that authenticated him as the Christ of God. Jesus was categorical that contrary to popular narratives of Jewish religion, the vision and imagination in the Hebrew scriptures of the creator of the universe exercising his right to rule was not through coercive power, but rather embodied in the suffering Christ. Thus, in Jesus submitting to crucifixion and death and being raised from the dead, he subverted, I repeat this, in Jesus submitting to crucifixion and death and being raised from the dead, he subverted the logic and ethos of human empires and self-centeredness, opening the way to defeating all power patterns that stand in opposition to what God intended for and through Israel and for the world. This, the cross, is the embodiment of a different logic, different patterns, embody, that manifest, perform love, justice, and shalom. That's their logic. Rather than fear, guilt, and shame. It is this power, this logic, these patterns that confront the power of fear, dehumanization, and estrangement. In Jesus' death, he triumphed over the patterns of power and relations that coerce and dehumanize. God's rule in Christ is not about the exercise of power that conquers through violence and inflicting suffering on the other. Christ's submission to the violence of empire was the very assault to human propensity to self-deception, illusion of superiority, invisibility, and violence against the other. I am suggesting that it is this story that we are invited into by Christ. The story in which, under God's rule in Christ, we subvert together in him, by the Holy Spirit, illusions of superiority that have been manifested in imperialism as we know it. It is the story that ought to define us who make a claim to live by the story of Jesus of Nazareth, who live by the story of your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let me conclude. What does this call us to? First, we acknowledge that we live in empire. We bear witness to the gospel. We bear witness to the gospel, not to Christianity. We bear witness to the gospel in social contexts where empire reigns. And Christianity is part of that, where the dominant narratives are performance of coloniality of being and power. Sadly, let's acknowledge that it is true our sociologies bear the marks of empire, either as perpetrators, beneficiaries, or victims, sometimes all three simultaneously or sequentially. As Denise Ackerman reminds us, we live in a world of displaced people, of war, exile, devastated communities, abuse, poverty, depression, anxiety, and abandonment. I'm therefore suggesting that rather than celebrate and positing Christianity as a beacon of hope in the face of the violence of empire, the place we live, that story of Christianity challenges us to bear witness to the authentic gospel, the good news borne by the one who was crucified. And therefore, firstly, let's recognize and name Christianity's complicity with empire. To perceive and name it as Jesus did. For while we cannot take responsibility for the narratives that has shaped our social locations and our conceptions or misconceptions of the gospel, it is our duty, it behoves us to take responsibility what we do with them now, because that will impact upon the narratives we pass on. I hope that those of us who bear the burden of a history of Christianizing the world, the burden of the history of empire, will hear this. I hope that those who bear the brunt of empire, they breathe this, they too will join on this journey. I plead for us that we recognize and name this collusion and its deception. Secondly, in perceiving and naming the deception for what it really is, we are drawn by the Spirit of Christ into lamenting. As Emmanuel Katongole puts it, lamenting is a way of seeing, standing, and wrestling and arguing with God. And that's a way of hoping in the midst of the ruins, and may I add, of empire. A discipline that involves many actions, crying out, exercising memory, maintaining silence, repenting, earnest praying. Lament is honesty before God and each other, as Professor Sonchan Ram has said. Let's lament together with Emmanuel Katongole, who asked, what accounts for the dismal social impact of Christianity in Africa? Why has Christianity, despite its overwhelming presence, failed to make a significant dent in the social history of the African continent? Let's lament with Howard Thurman, African-American author, philosopher, theologian, civil rights leader, himself a grandchild of slaves. Why is it, I quote, that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with the issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotence due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion, or is it due to a basic weakness in the religion itself? This question is searching for a dramatic demonstration of the impotency of Christianity. Let's lament, let's sit in that valley of lament to consider. Effective lament would lead us to the next. For perceiving, naming, lamenting, that leads us into the valley of lament, the place where I propose we live longer. We're very uncomfortable with the desert of lament. And yet it's there where we are beckoned to renounce that story, to renounce our collusion. To renounce is the first step in the journey of repentance. Renouncing as part of our response to bearing witness to God's love, justice, and shalom. We need to heed the rebuke of Jesus for distorting the story of Jesus, the good news. The reproach of Jesus to his disciples is a reproach to the religion of Christianity for misperceiving, misnaming, and misrepresenting Christ. Renouncing, however, as part of the discipline of lament, relocates us to yearning and seeking to be grasped by the real power that is the gospel of Christ, the power that engenders justice, peace, and shalom. Therefore, instead of conferences like that of the World Bank, together with the churches, we heed the summons of Jesus to connect with the victims of empire, to identify with the list of these brothers and sisters of mine. Authentic renunciation will lead us to relocation. What does that mean? We are going to sit and learn from those who've suffered the violence of empire. They will teach us what justice really means. This imagination that we got to help them, it is us need their help to be redeemed from this socialization, this bondage with narratives of fear, guilt, and shame. It is them who invite us away from the centers to the margins. Such relocating is not about helping the poor, romanticizing with poverty or margins, but rather responding to Jesus' invitation to follow him in his work of love, justice, and shalom, submitting to his spirit in the work of undoing distorted and disordered power patterns and relations in the world of which we have become a part. This is the political work engendered by authentic gospel witness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. About 30 minutes in Q&A session. So people on Zoom, if you have any questions, go to the reaction buttons and then press raise hand, and I can point you out to ask questions. People here in this room, if you have any questions, you can raise your hands, and then I can point you out to ask questions. Bishop, I have a question. You defined the word empire in this way. Empire is not only a political entity, but also It is a type of exercising power in a coercive way in all sectors of our society. And you have given us some examples about how badly we misuse our power in different areas of life and practices. And the examples are so depressing and destructive from my viewpoint. But on the other hand, I wonder, can you find any example in the entire history of Christianity and mission about its positive and constructive outcome when empire and Christianity are intertwined in a particular given context to enhance God's mission? Such as maybe the Reformation and also reformers. Inevitably, they were using the power in politics and also economy to complete their God-given calling to reform the religion at the time. So, any example, is it all the time bad and destructive, or it can bring some kind of positive outcome?
Thank you very much. Firstly, in speaking about something becoming a norm, by that itself means there are exceptions. But the exceptions prove the norm. So are there exceptions? And the answer is yes.
Okay.
But we will not even appreciate the exceptions if we use the same lenses of looking at history. The tragedy is that our historiography is itself stuck in methodologies of empire. One such methodology, I argue, is mission. Mission is essentially a construct of empire. But we use the same conception to try and understand the action of God in human history. And of course, we miss it because we are using a methodology that doesn't help us success. So what Jesus challenges us is, how can we read history from the perspective of the cross and the resurrection? I suggest that the people who teach us the benefits of gospel witness are not the missionaries who came to Africa, are not the missionaries who went to Latin America, no, it's those who suffered the brunt of this association between mission and colonialism. They are the ones who can tell us, was there anything good that you experienced? So one of the tragedies in Western scholarship is, not too much to be said, the books that fill courses in missiology are books that follow that pattern. So I'm simply inviting us, can we find a different way of reading our story? Because even the way we read our story, even the way we read the story of Christianity justifies Christianity as a form itself, and we perpetuate the same. So I could argue, I dare, that today's quote-unquote centers of missionary outreach, Nigeria, Korea, what are the others, are essentially performing the same narrative, albeit possibly in a much cruder way, because they may not have the vestiges and the powers that prior generations had. I am actually suggesting that maybe for a moment there is language we renounce because it doesn't help us. And part of that is the language of mission. Is there a different way of reading the story of Jesus and the imperative of that story for those who identify themselves in the world? My reading and study thus far says to me that the word mission is an imposition on the biblical narrative. It doesn't exist. What there is both from the old and in the new, is witness, bearing witness. So suppose we ask, what do the bearers of the witness of the story of Jesus, of the gospel, what do they look like? Where is the evidence of justice, shalom, and peace? And I can tell you, yes, we will find it. But it's not my task now to discuss the exception. It's we must rethink even our very methodologies.
Bishop, thank you so much for another very interesting and thought-provoking lecture today, next to your also sermon on Wednesday, 2 weeks ago. When you start your lecture, I was very excited when you started by saying theology is by nature a biography, and theology is a sociology, and sociology affects our theology. And then you gave us about who you are, you become as a result of the upbringing. And all those makes me excited to learn that you are going to introduce us a theology, which is a biography of the other side, let's say so first, let's see that. And then you, later on, you start again. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, do we have other lenses so we can look at this, find a solution or find, because what we are doing, we are diagnosing the colonization and says, okay, this is this, that is true. So how can we find a way, a new way to be Christian or whatever we wanted to name it, and to be witness or witnessing and to do mission or that kind of things? How can we start finding ways? Because I enjoyed very much, that's actually a question to myself too. The problem with us, we've been educated in the West and still we are using the methodology, the lens, all that kind of equipments. We are saying being deceptive to the faith, modern faith we have. We are still using the same ingredients to create a diagnostic and then medicine. And again, we might get again to where we are again. Let's say I am Iranian from the Middle East. And the story you just told us is not new to us, because sadly, every single religion in the Middle East is very much linked to empire, spread by the empire. And the moment they become stronger, that the follower of that, they become again oppressor. Let's give you an example of Iran. From Mithraism to Zoroastrianism, and how the empire tried to push Zoroastrianism to spread around and to Islam. And then when Iran accepted forced to accept Islam, turned it into Shiism, and then made it their own empire and forced it to others. You see, this cycle is going on and on and on. The oppressed become oppressor, and creating a new empire. And how can we stop this cycle? And then if we wanted to create a new narrative, as you mentioned, and how can we really start thinking about creating a new narrative within our Christian faith? For example, would that narrative, this new narrative, finding a new, at least preventing new empires to come back in another name, the oppressor become oppressed become oppressor. For example, let's say, do we need to change to start thinking about a new definition of theology? Because for me, I always have problem with the definition of theology being a study of God. No, it's not. Do we need to have another definition? I mean, do we need to start from something which, again, as you mentioned, link to our own theological biography of understanding? My struggle is that how can we introduce new lens? New lens can generate a new drug and can really. Do you know what I?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Sorry about that. It's my own struggle.
I think the answer is not, it's not an answer, it's just a response. Is to say that where you are, I wish everything you've expressed, I wish you were typical. In other words, I wish the conversations in centers like this were centers of everything you've done is lament. And I am suggesting we are not lament. We actually hate the value of lamentation.
Yeah.
We hate it, but we don't realize that it is in that valley that lies our hope. I don't have an answer, my sister. My answer is this: why aren't we asking these questions? Why aren't we asking, is there a different methodology? Now, I can hazard some guess. I was at a theological center in this city, and I said, if I was teaching theology, if I was running an institution, a theological institution, I don't run one, I've never had that opportunity, I would delete systematic theology on the curriculums of African theological seminaries. I would simply delete it. I would delete missiology as a discipline. I think renouncing means you stop certain things. Methodologically, let me just say this. What I'm attempting is narrative, not just as a genre, but as a method. So you notice that what I have done is tell the story. What I'm really asking us to do, can we grapple with the story of Christianity, ask patterns of power it represents, or even where we dwell, where we are. I'm seeing my brother here from Ethiopia. I could tell stories about Ethiopia and its current story and its current violence. And you can't deny that it's associated. You can't come out of that violence by using violence as your method of trying to make sense. Who has more power? And so on. So narrative, I commend as actually a methodology. As a methodology. And I think that it's because narrative, I can say this, you were asking about, I didn't have time to tell you why I'm so focused on narrative. It's what, my father was a philosopher, I didn't know. My father was a theologian, I didn't know. Until I began to remember, my goodness, how does the fireplace become a place of learning? Who said that libraries of books, I could go on. In other words, I hope we are shocked enough to stop and say something has drastically gone wrong. But I think we are not, we are riding on empire that has lasted, and we think something wonderful is going to happen out of the same thing. You know, no. My challenge, my sister, is that we are continuing business as usual. We are offering PhDs in the same. I mean, if you put me at Oxford Center for Mission Studies, there are certain topics that I would not allow people to study. I would simply say, no, you are perpetuating the same reading. But who am I to say? I think that this is a conversation we must have. In other words, our conversations in our different centers must be different. The conversation in the House of Bishops of the Church of Uganda must be different.
So yes, we go to Columbia on Zoom, and then we go to you. So Columbia, yeah.
Yes, Bishop Zach, lovely to see you, my friend. Just following the narrative, the question of narrative and the need to imagine and practice a different way. Then we also must craft or tell stories of what I may term successful gospel witness, or where there are case studies of gospel witness. It will be important to explore that, hear stories about that, and tell stories about that as a way of doing things differently. So it would be nice to hear more about case studies or stories or narratives of gospel witness are as much as authentic as possible to what Christ was trying to teach and to model. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, the challenge is that we want to tell the stories. Let's put it differently. How do we let those stories be told by the owners of those stories? Because we like to tell people stories. Then you say, my brother Caribbean, good to see you. Successful gospel witness. That's how we work. We're thinking about successful.
Branding.
As though we have been called to succeed in. This is not our thing. And all I'm saying is that we're going to absolutely create a space in which the owners of the stories can tell their story. Testimony, rather than us. So, and the way we really do that is how do we ensure that those stories are being told and are they are informing theological discourse. And that's a conversation to be had. Yes, those stories must be told, but they are not to be told by me. I go to Nairobi and I come away and I tell you, here is a successful story. No. The person from Nairobi or from the slums of Kampala, and from the, I can tell you stories of an amazing work of the gospel in the prison walls of Kampala, in the slums of Kampala. But actually, how do we make that story told by the person who lives in the slum? How do we? And I can share stories on how we could do that, but let's not be in a hurry to find solutions. Again, that's the way we are socialized. We are quick to find solutions. Can we stay a bit longer and ask, what has really happened to us? Let's stay a bit longer. We are uncomfortable with asking this question because we think this thing is good. This thing is bad. Let's not try to rescue it. Maybe once we hit that rock bottom, we will be able to say, oh, wow, we will see something new.
Two points. Number one, I'm sure this is an excellent paper, excellent presentation. And I was just wondering, in which circles are we exploring this? In the political realm, in the spiritual, religious circles, and economic forums? And how has been your experience in talking to these different sectors? And the second question then is, how can we take this narrative within the Christian church and stay? Sorry, I think I forgot my second question. But if you can answer my first question, I'll think about the second question again. How has your personal experience been? Because it's a hard saying what you're saying, and it is imperative though.
I am actually totally amazed.
Yeah.
I never will forget being invited to a conference of Muslims in Uganda, and I was invited to speak on justice. And the first thing I did, I apologized to the entire audience, about 600 Muslims, young. And the first thing I said is, forgive us Christians because we made Jesus a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I come as a follower of Jesus in this space, and I think we can have conversations about Jesus together. So, but that's not, I came to speak about justice, but I speak about justice because of Jesus. I have no other story to tell about justice except Jesus. And so we spoke about it. And one Muslim stood up and said, we like everything you have said, but we are not yet ready to believe you because of what Christianity did to us.
Yeah.
The way in which you did this. So I think to say that this is not a story for politics, for religion. No. The first thing we must free ourselves from is these Western Enlightenment ways of learning.
Mm.
These subjects. It's
Mm.
horrible. We were taught subjects.
Yeah.
So theology, politics, this. Can we find a different way of experiencing learning? And that is not going to come from the West. It's not going to come from Oxford.
Mm.
Oxford is there to protect its paradigms.
Mm.
It's going to have, I think those of us from the South need to be more confident
Mm.
about our own understanding of the world, our methodologies, the cooking pot.
Mm.
Rather than being excited by the cooker, can we have a conversation? What does the cooking pot teach us?
Mm.
What does the fireplace teach us?
Mm.
What does the elephant teach us? What does nature teach us? Because we are closer rather than concrete.
Mm.
So I think that these are it's a paradigm shift we are calling ourselves. But you see, I'm speaking in English.
Mm.
How can we have conversations in our mother tongues? One of the reasons I became confident to say mission is not a thing, I have not found it in any of our African languages. It's not there. There is no equivalent word for mission. If you're going to have a conversation on mission, you must use the English word. And I'm like, no.
Yeah. And the second question I remember now, the oppressed becoming the oppressor. For years and years, as you said, Christianity through its powers has influenced the world. Now, because of that regret of colonialism that was intertwined with the religion, Western world is now saying sorry to the whole world. So much sorry that in the Western world, you're willing to oppress the Christians, your own Christians, and not oppress the Muslim or others. And Islam is taking over the West. Oppressed becoming the oppressor.
It's absolutely what you can expect.
Yeah.
You see, as soon as patterns of power that I reflect on, what's the DNA? It's fear, guilt, and shame. Anything that embodies, that seeks the fear of the other, the shaming of the other, this sense of guilt, anything done out of guilt. I mean, there is, please forgive me, there is genocide guilt, there is anti-Semitism guilt. You can't see clearly if you're acting out of guilt, if you're acting out of fear, the fear of the other. So all of those are systems that are acting out of this, what I call coloniality of being. It's not colonialism because it predates, it's a way of inhabiting the world that disregards the other. And yet we are because we are together.
Right.
So we definitely, that is what will happen. So there will be a book has been written when the victim becomes the perpetrator. Absolutely. I think it's Freire who said the vision of the oppressed is to exchange positions with the oppressor. And the fear of the oppressor is to lose the position of privilege. That's true. That's how the thing is working. That's how universities work, and so on and so forth. But in order for us to live out the gospel story of Jesus, we must be willing to suffer the powers of that empire. The cross is not a good place to be. I mean, we preach it, we believe it, and again we reduced it to my sins, We failed because even our conversations on the cross are not about the cross of Jesus. No, they're not the Roman cross. It's we created a different cross that is focused on some sins. But so it is going to challenge us to rethink.
So because of time, we are taking 3 more questions at the finish. So Zeb and after Kenneth, then
Nobody else on the line, just so that they're included.
Yes, there is one question here. How do we define a successful gospel story? What are the marks? But you can ask your question. Then if I have the time, then you can ask.
Maybe more just a comment because just number one, what you just shared, it very much defines the space where I'm working, where I'm practicing, and what even brought me here. I don't know if we should change the name of the school to Oxford Center for Witness Studies, but I think this is a
speaking my language.
But this is very much a place of experimenting with these ideas, and I think I really landed in a place where these kind of conversations can be had. I had another friend who went to another institution with a similar desire coming from the same context, and it was actually very much shut down. So I have a lot to process, a lot to say. I'm also studying in this specific area. So I will just leave it at that because there's others, and I don't have time. Maybe if I could ask my second question, are you free for dinner?
That's a great question.
There are certain conditions about my dinner, so let's have a one-on-one. I'll see whether your dinner qualifies. No, I'm just no. But thank you very much. Let me make a comment here. There is unwillingness about centers of learning, and one of the things the Western Church needs to hear is that honestly, they are no longer centers of learning. The future doesn't belong with what is produced in Oxford. I mean, Oxford will produce AstraZeneca. What is the thing that they produce?
Yeah.
But it is not going to save the world. First of all, what caused AstraZeneca is this way of living. And all to say, we've got to the confidence Ethiopia, grapple with the story of Ethiopia. And yes, take a break. How do we, because this idea of one center is the idea of empire, so theological education is still a thing of the West. The question we have is, how do we decenter that? How do all these become centers?
I need a dinner with you.
Right, thank you very much.
Yeah, mine is just a comment. Thank you so much, Bishop, for that boldness. And I appreciate, I think perhaps maybe how you emphasize on relocating. I think that's one thing perhaps needs to, maybe you break it down even by the work, because when you kept saying about voices in terms of telling stories, and I think that's the new definition of indigeneity in terms of privileging the voices of the people. They are telling their own stories, with histories, with their own cosmological imaginaries. And I appreciate the whole thing that mentioned, which the West is struggling with, is to agree that there is a need for epistemological shift. And until that epistemology shifted, the narrative cannot change. And perhaps maybe, Bishop, maybe pursuing further with regard to when I could listen to you, I could hear a lot of Achille and then at the background, Taiwo Olufemi, some of the African philosophers who are wrestling with decolonialism and coloniality. And perhaps maybe just to boldly, mine is to encourage to boldly unpack, relocate, and just let us know what relocate is in terms of positioning. Yeah,
I learned some of this really in my work as a bishop in the city of Kampala. The most enriching, remarkable places where I found Jesus, where I was challenged about my life, was never in the cathedral. Never. The cathedral was a terrible place. I think, but the places that taught me more about Jesus were the slums. So relocating means that we want to see, not with the eyes. We are all privileged here, and the only way we see is with the privilege. So the question is really how we connect with those who actually can tell the story better. The story of Jesus is going to be told better, not by us, but by those who are there. And our benefit is to connect. So I think it's how do these places of hardship, the people who suffer the violence of empire, how do they become places where we learn what the gospel is? So relocating is also epistemological. We make a choice to relocate the way we think. If it doesn't start with the mind. So, I mean, my friends have been saying, does that mean you should not read any Western books? No, when I read them with a different mindset. I am questioning power. Every time I take a book, I read it to this mindset of power. Is he, So I'm very suspicious because of this idea of dominating. And I think, but you see the guys who, I'm a privileged guy, and here I am, but how does my learning take advantage of that place that is not on the margins? In a different way, we can talk about, you remember Nathaniel? Nathaniel says, can anything good come from Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? That's the way we are. We are Nathaniels. Can anything come from? But surprise, surprise, not just can anything good. In fact, the entire future came from where? From Nazareth. And I think it's the same idea.
Thank you. Final question, Dr. Ben. Item.
After 40 years of meeting you in Kampala, I have no illusions. I'm only too well aware of the defects of the Church of Uganda, the Church of England, the churches of Kenya, and so on, the transients and sins of the British Empire. But didn't God create all people incarnate, material, in the flesh, local, to a certain extent, ignorant, mortal? Is there a culture under the sun which doesn't have a legal or jural process which institutes coalition? Is there a culture under the sun which doesn't have politics in the terms of a polity and the distribution of power? Is there a culture under the sun which does not have every normal aspect of culture in order to regulate? Obviously, it can be very badly done, the use and structure of power.
Totally, absolutely. And the question I'm raising is not a utopian view of the world in which there is no regulation, in which there is no government, in which there is no. On the contrary, I'm saying what dominates the world, what I call the sin structure that dominates the world, embedded within it is fear, guilt, and shame. And I'm suggesting that the gospel story commends to us structuring of power informed by justice, peace, and love. So the question we must grapple with is what do regulations of that kind look like? The word used is kingdom about the gospel, kingdom. So it's not to suggest there is no kingdom, but it's a kingdom with different patterns of power. What are those patterns of power commended in the gospel? That's essentially, I think, the challenge. And it's all there. Yes, Matthew 5. And it's all practical, by the way. It is practical. And I think we'll ask the hard questions. So essentially, this is a question about sociology, it's a question of politics, it's a question of religion. This is about how we inhabit the world together. And I am suggesting that the revolution in the story of Jesus is much, much more profound than what we have made it to be, spiritual. It's about how this world is constructed, lives, how we live together. And I'm really suggesting that what we have as Christianity is such a departure from the gospel that it needs to be renounced for what it is, and we try and find a new way. I am suggesting we listen to Jesus' rebuke. How foolish you are. How foolish we are that we've become so bonded to violence when there is a different way embodied in the cross. And I think it is possible.
So thank you, Bishop, for your insightful and also challenging lecture and also your robust kind of interactions with us. And I hope that you will have a nice dinner.
Hard to say.
Shall we get our hands together? Thank you.